right, welcome back everybody. Let's start talking about how we perceive people. And specifically, we're going to focus on social perception. Let's define that. Social perception is simply the process that we all engage in to make sense of other people. And in this section, we're going to talk about some of the elements of raw data that we process in order to make sense of people. So that can be divided into three primary areas. One would be physical information. So when we look at this picture and we're trying to make sense of these two people, we're going to examine their sex, we're going to look at their age, we're going to see how they're dressed. Obviously, there must be some type of celebration going on, like for Halloween. So we're going to look to see what they're wearing. So we're talking about just basic physical information. Now, as I mentioned, though, in order to make sense of them, we also looked at the situational information, and we were able to see that there was some type of celebration taking place. So yes, we do, when we try to make sense of people, process situational information. If I'm trying to make sense of the people in this picture, I need to make sense of what's going on in that situation. And at this point, I don't know what's going on in that situation. But for me to make sense of anybody, I need to know what's going on in the situation that they're behaving in. So we'll talk a little bit about situational information that we focus on. And then finally, we'll talk about behavioral information. And we'll focus quite a bit on nonverbal information. And that's because people have a lot of control over what they say. And because people have a lot of control over what they say, they're not necessarily always telling us the truth. They're not always necessarily giving us information that's very diagnostic of who they are. But it's possible that I can look at somebody and tell much better who they are, what type of person they are, what type of traits they might have. So it's possible that I can look at this person's face and tell that she's interested in what I have to say, but maybe her body is telling a different story and she's kind of defensive. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Let's jump in and let's first start talking about physical appearance. When you think about how we make sense of people, the first thing that we look at is somebody's face. And we make sense of people very quickly, spontaneously, even unconsciously, just by processing information from their face. We essentially read traits from a person's face. Traits like aggressiveness, trustworthiness, how likable they are. So when I look at this person, what type of trait am I reading from this person's face? Well, I know it's a mug shot, so already I don't have a very positive impression. This person is smiling or making some crazy face for a mugshot, so I can already tell this person doesn't have the best decision-making abilities. I just look at that face and that smile, and I can tell that this person doesn't care much for themselves in terms of dental health. So you can see that I've got a relatively negative impression of who this person is. Now here's another mugshot. This mugshot made its way all around the internet because this person's almost like a model. This guy is so good looking. But nonetheless, I make sense of some physical information about that face. And I can see, for example, something that really stands out is the person's tattoos. And times have changed a lot in terms of how we evaluate people with tattoos. But this person has tattoos on his face and his neck. So again, I'm thinking, well, he's in a mugshot. He's probably not the best decision maker. Even though I have a better impression of this guy relative to this guy, I still read quite a bit in, and I've got some relatively negative traits that I would probably assign to him. And I do this relatively unconsciously and very quickly. Same thing here. This is the exact opposite. Here I see this young girl. She's very pretty. She looks very sweet. And again, I think to myself, who is she? She looks to me like she's very approachable, like someone who'd be trustworthy. Now remember, I might be accurate, I might not be accurate, but we all engage in this behavior automatically upon encountering somebody. So some of the things that we glean from a person's face might be their aggressiveness, how trustworthy they are, how likable they are. And there is some evidence to show that we're reasonably good at assessing this just by looking at someone and getting a quick glimpse of who they are. Let me give you an example of some research that's been conducted. In this particular study, people were allowed to look at somebody and make an impression of them either without having much time at all. This is 1/10 of a second that they were allowed to look at some pictures. This is half a second, and that's 1 full second. So that is not much time at all. And then they were asked to rate these people based on how trustworthy they were, how competent, how likable, how aggressive, how attractive. And then all of their ratings were correlated with the ratings of people who were allowed to look at those pictures for essentially an unlimited amount of time. And these represent correlations between those very quick interpretations of the person and the interpretations of people who are allowed to look at those faces for a long time. And these correlation coefficients are relatively large, showing that there's quite a bit of an agreement between a very quick first impression and an impression that people were able to spend quite a bit more time on. So all that's really saying, bottom line, is even very quick impressions correlate with the impressions that we have once we're given a little bit more time to really think it out. So what kind of information are we really looking at? Of course, we're not just looking at a face, but that head is really quite prominent. And as a result, people developed theories over time. One was based on what's known as phrenology. And the whole idea was that the shape of a person's head and even like the little bumps and intricacies of a person's head told a lot about their personality. Now, of course, that was essentially discredited pretty quickly because there was no empirical evidence to show that the shape of a person's head predicted well the type of personality that they have. Well, things didn't stop there. There were some people who also had theories that the shape of a person's body told a lot about the type of person that the person was. So ectomorphs were kind of skinny and long, and they were seen as people who were kind of nervous and introverted. Endomorphs were seen as easygoing and extroverted. And mesomorphs, who had a more athletic type of build, were seen as more dynamic people and somewhat more aggressive. And as you would expect, that was largely discredited as well. So we can't really look at shapes of heads and shapes of bodies and get a sense of what's going on. What can we look at? What do we look at that seems to provide us with some reasonable information to understand a person? Well, our impressions are very much influenced by basic information that's in front of us, people's height, people's weight. And keep in mind, it's not always fair and it's not always accurate. For example, there's some research to show that when people look at someone who's overweight, they tend to see them as more messy and somewhat more disorganized in the way that they think. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's fair. Oftentimes, our impressions are based on stereotypic information. And never is that more important when we're looking at some racial differences in our society. People have implicit associations with others of different races. Specifically, in our community, a lot of people look at African American people and they initially think that the people are more aggressive. And that obviously is a problem, and that at least somewhat could explain why sometimes African American people, when put in a situation when they encounter police, are more likely to have some type of violent outcome. We're more likely to see people with glasses as intelligent. It used to be that when we saw people with tattoos and piercings, of course, we saw them as somewhat menacing and on the fringes of society, but times are changing. I look at the students in my classes, and my best, sweetest looking students, many of them have tattoos. It's just a common part of our culture. So of course, things change over time as well in terms of how we use the information that's readily available to us to develop an impression of those people. This is kind of interesting as well. Aside from the actual physical characteristics of the person, we often use information that the person brings with them. Like knickknacks that I might use to decorate my bedroom or my office. That can tell a lot about who I am, and people will use that information to make sense of me. So for example, if you were to visit my office, you'd see pictures of my family. So that's going to give you an impression of who I am. I value family, but you're also going to see like a sign up there that says no whining. So again, you're realizing Frank specifically picked this stuff to display in his office. It probably says something about who he is as a person, and you're going to use that information. Names can reveal a lot about people as well, or at least we think. For example, I have a relatively old school name, Frank. Think about a name like Gladys, which is another old school name. You are going to develop a different impression of someone named Gladys compared to a girl named Brittany, which is a much more modern name. Avatars in our modern day age could tell a lot about who people are. Because keep in mind, if someone picks this avatar, they're probably picking that avatar because it's pretty closely resembling how they look. And we have a lot of control over how we look. So someone who decides to look like this is probably going to have a personality that's quite different than a person who decides to look like this. This person is trying to convey a particular type of message to you. This person is trying to convey a particular type of message to you, not only through how they appear, but through the avatar that they decide to pick to represent who they are. So we use all kinds of physical information to make sense of the people who we encounter. Another neat thing has to do with people who have baby faces. And people who have baby faces tend to have large eyes and kind of a high brow, smooth skin, a rounded chin. In other words, they have a face that reminds them of a baby's face. Here's a beautiful girl. She has a baby face. She can be into her 30s, into her 40s, and she's still going to have characteristics of a baby face. Now, we tend to view people who have baby faces as warmer, often kinder, more honest, and those are positive traits. But we sometimes also see them as weaker, more submissive, more naive. Because remember, we're talking about traits that would be consistent with a baby. And babies, just by nature, are kind of weak, somewhat submissive, and naive. So sometimes it's positive to be associated with those baby-faced features, but there's a negative side as well. We can compare that to a face that's much more mature. This is a picture of John Glenn. And John Glenn, even when he was a young man, he had relatively mature features. He has relatively small eyes, and he has, this angular jaw, not that rounded jaw that we saw in the previous picture. And when we see people that are more mature in their appearance, we just tend to see them somewhat differently, somewhat less kind, for example, somewhat stronger, less submissive, and of course, a little bit more streetwise, not quite as naive. Now, why is it that we might see these baby-faced people in these relatively positive terms, or at least in these relatively baby-like characteristics? It could be a product of evolution, at least to some regard. And that's because we need to bond, with babies. Babies are really a lot of trouble. If we don't come to love them and bond with them very quickly, things are not going to work out very well for our species. Well, it could be that we afford those same qualities to people who remind us of babies, people who have those baby-like characteristics. So in that sense, it could be a byproduct of evolution. It could be also that people who have those baby-like characteristics are just seen by us as somewhat happier. And if they're happier, they're somewhat less threatening. And if they're less threatening to us, we would see that they have more positive characteristics, and we'd be more likely to want to approach them. Let's switch gears and let's talk about some situational information that we would look at when we're trying to make sense of people. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that much of our life is very scripted. And what I'm talking about here are essentially preset notions that we have for various types of situations. Let me give you a good example. There's a script for what you should do when you encounter somebody in the hallway at school, if you know them. So let's say you encounter somebody, it's likely that you're going to go, "Hey, how are you?" And that they're going to say back to you, "Good, how are you?" And then you're going to say "I'm fine, thanks." And you keep walking, and that's the end of that script. The bottom line is we already know what we do when we encounter someone who we don't know all that well, but we're familiar with them, and we're both on our way to somewhere else. We just pretty casually greet them. That's the social script. Well, these social scripts allow us to predict people's goals and their behaviors, and also the likely outcomes of those interactions that we're going to have with them. In other words, these scripts provide us with some context for understanding people. Let me give you another example. As an instructor, I try to abide as much as I can to the script that is readily understood for the first day of class. So on the first day of class, even though I can do anything I want, in general, I'm going to go over the syllabus, I'm going to take attendance. I probably then usually engage in some type of icebreaker where the students have a chance to speak out and talk to each other and with me, because my whole goal is to have people become somewhat more comfortable so that throughout the semester they're going to speak up and engage in conversations. And then, of course, I need to get to business, so we're going to start talking probably about chapter 1. There's going to be some type of lecture. That is what you would expect on the first day of class because that's the general script. Now, as I mentioned, that information is going to provide some context for understanding people. If I engaged in this script, you're going to be thinking, all right, I know what to expect from this instructor. It looks like we're probably going to be able to get along. Imagine another instructor. who begins following that script by going over the syllabus and taking attendance, but then just launches right into chapter 1. And you're thinking to yourself, like, wow, we didn't even have a chance to kind of talk and get to know each other. And not only that, the person administered an exam because he expected you to read chapter 1 and come to class prepared. So you're already taking a difficult exam on day 1. And after the exam is done, the instructor assigns some research report. That's not a very fun day. So you can see that this person kind of went off script. So now you're going to evaluate that person. Well, when you evaluate a person who stays on the script, in that particular situation, you're probably having relatively positive thoughts about the person. You're thinking, I'm going to be able to get along with this instructor. But when someone goes off script and you put it into context, you're thinking, like, I'm not sure if I'm going to get along with this instructor. This instructor might have some traits that are relatively negative. All right, so I'm just talking about how the way that we understand the world to work provides context for how we make sense of people. Let's talk about some more behavioral information. It's kind of neat that sometimes we don't need much information to make sense of people. In fact, just a quick glimpse or a thin slice of behavioral information will often give us a pretty good idea of who someone is. So for example, I might look at somebody just real quickly, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, maybe just 90 seconds, and already get a really good sense of how much this person maintains eye contact, how often this person kind of smiles and nods, just a good sense of how they behave. All it takes is looking at a young child in this type of situation for a small amount of time to get a pretty good sense of the general type of personality that this kid has. But keep this in mind as well. We have a lot of control over the behaviors that we exhibit and over, like our facial expressions. And that means that we can hide our true feelings. So I might look at a person like this woman right here, and I don't really know what she's thinking because she's so good at hiding that. She's looking at somebody, and she might be looking at that person with disdain. She might have a relatively negative impression. But it's also possible she's looking at somebody, and she's thinking, that's the most gorgeous person I've ever seen. And she actually has a very favorable impression of that person. Because people can hide their true feelings so well, it helps if we can make sense of people using some relatively nonverbal cues. And those nonverbal cues often do give them away. Where do we get a lot of information that is nonverbal? Back to faces. Faces provide us with so much information. Via evolution, faces have been able to provide us with essentially consistent information that is almost universally understood. For example, if you were to show these 6 faces to people across the globe, they'd be able to tell you what type of emotion is being expressed. So regardless of who you talk to and where they grew up, they're going to tell that this is an angry woman and that this is a fearful man, that this lady is disgusted by something, that she's surprised, he's happy, and she's sad. Universal expressions. I found this kind of interesting when I found this picture. Law enforcement kind of sees more than just the 6 primary emotions, and they were notifying us of a 7th, and that's contempt. And really, when you look at that face, I think it does demonstrate contempt pretty well. You look at that guy, and he's clearly unhappy with whoever or whatever situation he's looking at. And it's possible that in law enforcement, they encounter that a lot. And that might be one reason why they're trying to train their people to understand what that type of facial expression means. Now, if you think about it, that's a really pretty good talent that we have developed. And if we're all across the globe able to identify these primary expressions pretty well, it's probably something that is developed naturally. And things that develop naturally are often things that have survival value. So they are things that have been passed along from our parents and our parents' parents, because the people who had those talents survived. How is it that this type of talent has some survival value? Let's talk about that next. Let's talk about what I mean by the anger superiority effect. This is the whole idea that it's really to our benefit to be able to identify someone who is angry or becoming angry. This is a picture of Bill Bixby when he played in the TV show The Incredible Hulk. And you didn't want to make Bill Bixby mad. And that's because when he got too mad, he would morph and change into the Incredible Hulk. And we not only are able to pick out angry faces, but we are particularly good at picking out people who are becoming angry. Because think about it, as someone is becoming angry, they're becoming more threatening to us. The threat is escalating, and it's in those situations that we need to do something to protect ourselves. So again, having this talent has some type of survival value. Another example would be the emotion of disgust. I can read it so well in this person's face that when I see someone in this situation, I kind of put that face on myself. Why does that have survival value? Because if he is about to taste some bad food and he has that face, I'm going to read that on him and I am not going to taste that food. So I'm less likely to be poisoned. I'm sure you've been in a situation where someone has said to you like, oh man, this milk smells terrible, smell it. And you're like, I don't need to smell it. I can tell just by looking on your face exactly how that milk smells. That is adaptive. That's my point. So facial expressions have become almost universally understood. There are some limits though, and one limit might be due to what we call outgroup homogeneity. And outgroup homogeneity has to do with the idea that people who are not like us, people who are in our outgroup, we tend not to appreciate all the individual differences that they have. We tend to see them as somewhat more all alike relative to the people in our own in-group. We can identify and notice lots of individual characteristics of the people that we see on a daily basis. And some of that is just due to practice because we come to know them so well. But people who are different from us and people who we don't interact with a lot, we're often unable to distinguish those small, subtle changes. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I live in Southeast Ohio. I'm a Caucasian man. I see lots of Caucasian men. And when I see a man like this, I can tell pretty easily that he's sad. Now, these are pretty subtle changes on his face, but I have a lot of practice with them. So people in my in-group, I can notice that pretty easily. But someone in my out-group, here's an Asian man. I do not see many people in my daily life who look like this man. According to the whole idea of outgroup homogeneity, I'm more likely to see this group of people as being more similar as my own people. I see that they're very different. And as a result, it's harder for me to read the expression on his face. So yeah, universally, we do understand facial expressions, but there are, of course, some limits. Now, of course, also when we're reading people's faces, the eyes become particularly important and impactful. In fact, when you look at something very intently, I will look at what you're looking at. So I will follow your gaze. We realize that the eyes hold a lot of important information. Direct eye contact as we're talking to one another holds each other's attention. Oftentimes, if you want to talk to someone, you'll wait until they look at you because you realize that when they're looking at you, they're paying attention to what you're saying. They are ready to hear you. It increases our arousal. People who engage in eye-to-eye contact are more likely to be seen as warm people, confident people. They're more likely to be seen as people who have respect for us. Of course, the whole eye-to-eye thing also can demonstrate some level of intimacy. We don't just stare into anybody's eyes. We tend to stare into the eyes of people who we like. Now, keep in mind, too, not everything is positive. Sometimes we're staring into the eyes of another person because we want to intimidate that person, or that person wants to intimidate us. Now, people who do not engage in direct eye contact are often perceived in relatively negative terms. Sometimes they're just seen as cold or maybe fearful. Maybe they're trying to avoid eye contact because they're somewhat intimidated by you. It could be that they're just shy, but these are relatively negative traits that we see. Another thing is that we might just think that they're disinterested. Remember, you often wait until people are looking at you before you start to talk to them because you realize that when they're looking at you, they're paying attention to you. Well, someone who is not looking at you is not paying attention to you. That means that they're somewhat not interested in you. And if they're not interested in you, you're probably not going to have a particularly positive impression of them. Let's talk a little bit more about some nonverbal cues. Touch is really a very interesting thing, and that's because it provides so much information. Just the right touch can really change a person's emotions. Think about a nice firm handshake. Of course, we expect that in our culture upon greeting someone, particularly with men. Of course, the way that we greet people evolves over time. The fist bump is popular nowadays. Someone who is upset, we might come and give them a sympathetic pat on the back. And we understand in our culture that means something. Like I put my hand on your shoulder, I pat you on the back. I'm trying to say like, hey, I'm here for you. I've got your back. I'm willing to listen to what your problems are. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but it's a wonderful situation where you're interested in someone and you can tell that they're interested in you. And then all of a sudden they put their hand on your hand. And man, you probably just tingle. And all it takes is that touch to convey a lot of very personal information. Now, typically, this type of touch is expressing some type of friendship or nurturance or maybe even sexual interest, because we don't typically touch people unless we like them, and we usually don't want to be touched by people unless we like them. Now, that said, touch can be used in somewhat of a negative way as well to establish maybe dominance or control. So you've probably been in a situation where someone goes a little bit overboard with the firm handshake, and they're almost hurting your hand. So they're trying to convey something to you. I'm strong, I'm powerful, I'm in control of this situation. It could be that someone is giving some attention to someone else that's somewhat unwanted. In this situation, this young man is saying to this young woman, I'm in control here. I own you. I will touch you when I want to touch you on my own terms. And clearly, she doesn't like that. Let's end on a little discussion about how the rules of nonverbal information differ by culture. And that makes sense because just think about verbal information. I mean, we don't all speak according to the same languages. Well, we would assume that the nonverbal information that we provide to each other doesn't necessarily translate from one culture to the next one-to-one. Sometimes there are some differences. Let's just talk about a couple of them. You'd think nothing would be more universal than nodding your head up and down to say yes and shaking your head from left and right to say no. But what's interesting is apparently in Bulgaria, it's the exact opposite. They're going to nod their head up and down to say no and shake their head from left and right to say yes. Bottom line is the rules somewhat differ by culture. Another interesting place to see this is with personal space. Think about in our culture. This space really close, like within 1.5 feet, is very intimate space. The only people I'm comfortable to be in this space would be like my wife, really. Then most people in my life, they can invade my personal space, which is within about 3 or 4 feet. And here's where I'm just talking to people casually, everything's fine. People in my classroom, they're in my social space. They're not right up on me, but we're all communicating, we're talking, everything's fine. So if I have a student, for example, come up to me and start getting really close to me and like whispering in my ear, I'm already starting to feel uncomfortable because I'm thinking you're in my intimate space. I'm thinking other people are going to probably think, why are you in my intimate space? This is perhaps sending a message to others that I don't want to send. But that's in our culture. So think about, for example, in some Latin American cultures where they have much more personal contact, close personal contact. In those situations, it's much more common that people on a regular everyday basis are going to be in this type of space. And let's say I'm visiting a Latin American culture and I'm talking with someone and they get right up in my face and I kind of step back. They're not going to like that and they're going to think I'm disrespecting them. So those are just some of the differences that we notice in nonverbal behaviors. There are also some interesting differences in the gestures that people use. I mean, we use this a lot, I think, in our own culture, just to say, like, everything's okay, I'm satisfied. However, in Brazil, at least if that okay sign is turned a particular way, it's essentially equivalent to flipping somebody off. This one is kind of hysterical. In our culture, that has evolved to be known as, like the rock and roll horns, like rock on. It doesn't say much more than that, but it's a relatively positive thing, kind of like, hey, party on, everybody. Well, apparently in many other countries, it means something very specific. In other parts of the world, to make this sign at someone is to tell them that their wife is cheating on them, which is kind of crazy to me that there would be cultures that would even have some type of sign to show them that. But again, it's just to show you that Just like verbal communication is not the same across cultures, nonverbal communication is not the same across cultures. A couple other interesting examples: thumbs up, just some sign of approval in many countries, but in other countries, it's kind of seen as up yours. This one is probably the most bizarre. Crossed fingers. We use this a lot in our society just to kind of hope for someone that things are going to work out all right, just to wish them luck. Well, apparently in Vietnam, crossed fingers are said to resemble female genitals, hence this gesture is seen as lewd. So if you're in Vietnam, don't cross your fingers to wish someone good luck. Well, that's about it for this section, but stay tuned because there's much more social psychology coming up soon.